The cold came down from the mountains like something alive and hungry, a physical weight that pressed against the world until the very air seemed to fracture. Sheriff Ethan Cole felt it bite through the thick hide of his buffalo coat as he rode the frozen plains north of Bitter Ridge, his breath turning to white mist that hung suspended in the still air before dissolving into nothingness. The mare beneath him, a good horse named Sable, picked her way carefully through snow that had fallen 3 days prior and now lay crusted over with a treacherous layer of ice that snapped like glass under her hooves. It was December 15th, 1878, and the sun hung low and pale in the western sky, a useless white disk offering light but absolutely no warmth to the landscape below. Ethan had no particular business riding out this far into the desolation. His jurisdiction effectively ended at the creek 2 miles back, but sleep had become an impossibility in recent months, and the cabin he returned to each night felt more like a tomb than a home, so he rode to outpace the silence. The loneliness was easier to bear when he kept moving, when the physical act of managing the horse and watching the horizon occupied the space in his mind usually reserved for ghosts. He was 35 years old and felt 60, his spirit calcified by a war that had ended a decade ago and a personal loss that felt as fresh as a raw wound. For 3 years now, he had worn the badge and done his duty, protecting a town that barely needed protecting and enforcing laws in a place where most folks were too tired to break them, only to return to empty rooms that still smelled faintly of lavender and the woman who had died there. The mare suddenly stopped, her ears snapping forward and her nostrils flaring as she tasted something on the wind that Ethan could not yet perceive. His hand moved instantly to the Winchester rifle in its scabbard, a reflex born from too many years of war and frontier violence where hesitation meant a shallow grave. He scanned the white expanse ahead, his eyes narrowing against the glare, but nothing moved in that frozen tableau. The wind had died completely, leaving a silence so absolute he could hear the blood rushing in his own ears and the creak of frozen leather. Then he saw it, a dark, jagged line against the pristine snow, not straight like a fallen branch or a shadow, but erratic and desperate. He urged Sable forward, the horse fighting him slightly, and as they drew closer, the line resolved into what his soldier's mind had already recognized. It was blood, fresh enough that it hadn't frozen completely. A stark red trail leading north toward the tree line. Ethan drew the Winchester and worked the lever action, the metallic click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet, and followed the trail. After 200 yards, the drag marks widened, the snow churned up and dark with fluids he chose not to identify until necessary. He saw the body before his conscious mind registered it as a person. A figure lay face down in the snow, half buried by the white powder that had blown over in the night, dark hair stiff with ice and matted against broad shoulders. It was the shape of a woman, though larger and more muscular than most women he knew in town, and she lay with the stillness of the dead. Ethan dismounted, keeping the rifle leveled, and approached on foot, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. There was no movement, no rise and fall of breath that he could see, and the body was already dusted with a layer of frost that made it look like part of the landscape. He knelt beside the figure and reached out with his free hand, stripping off his glove to touch the neck and check for a pulse, expecting the marble cold of a corpse. The skin was indeed freezing, colder than flesh had any right to be, and he almost pulled back to mount up and ride for the coroner, but then he felt it. Faint, thready, slow, but undeniably there. She was alive. Ethan holstered the rifle and rolled her over carefully, and the revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was an Apache woman. He knew it immediately from her high, broad cheekbones, the bronze tone of her skin beneath the grey pallor of hypothermia, and the style of the torn buckskin clothing visible beneath the snow. Her lips were blue. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes like diamonds, and her hands were bound behind her back with thick manila rope, the kind used for tying livestock. He pulled his knife and sawed through the bindings, noting the deep, raw grooves in her wrists where she had fought against the restraints until her skin was flayed open. When he unbuttoned his coat to wrap her, he saw the rest of the damage. Her back was a ruin of scars, whip marks, old and new, layered over each other in a topographic map of suffering. Some of the newer wounds, weeping infection that smelled sweet and rot-like, even in the freezing air. And there, on her left wrist, was a brand. The letter D burned into her flesh with a hot iron, marking her as one would mark a heifer. The snow stretched empty in all directions, offering no clues but the faint, wind-blown ruts of a wagon that had passed heading east perhaps 6 or 8 hours ago. Whoever had done this was long gone, leaving her here to freeze. The woman's breathing hitched, a terrible rattling sound, and her lips moved without producing sound, her body fighting a battle her mind had likely already lost. Ethan thought of Margaret, his wife, 3 years dead, who had lain in his arms, bleeding out from an arrow in her chest, trying to speak while the life drained out of her, and the memory rose up like bile. He had failed Margaret, failed his son, coming home 3 days too late to save them from the raid that had left his cabin burning and his world in ashes. For 3 years he had carried that failure like a stone in his chest, a weight that made every breath a labor. But looking at this battered woman, something dormant and fierce ignited within him. This woman would not die. Not today, not in the snow, not while he still had breath in his lungs. He whistled for Sable, lifting the woman with a gentleness that belied his size. She was heavier than Margaret had been, solid muscle and bone, a lifetime of hard living written into her frame. He draped her across the saddle and mounted behind her, keeping one arm around her waist to hold her secure. He knew he should ride to town, to the doctor, but he also knew that bringing an Apache woman into Bitter Ridge, a town seething with old hatreds and populated by men who had lost family to raids, was a death sentence. They would not see a victim, they would see an enemy, and they would hang her before the circuit judge could even saddle his horse. Ethan turned Sable west instead of south, heading toward his cabin 6 miles outside of town, hidden in the dense pine forest where no one came unless invited. He urged the mare into a fast walk, acutely conscious of the woman's fading pulse against his arm and the way her body had gone limp and heavy. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red across the snow, and the temperature began its plummet toward 15 below zero, a cold profound enough to kill a healthy man, let alone one so broken. When the cabin finally appeared through the pines, a low structure of logs and stone he had built himself after the war, it looked like salvation. He kicked the door open, carrying the woman inside, and laid her on the bed in the main room before immediately setting about building a fire. His hands worked with automatic precision, kindling, wood, match, flame, while his mind raced through the medical knowledge he had gleaned from army field surgeons. The room began to warm, the fire casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls, and Ethan turned his attention back to the woman. He needed to get her out of the wet, frozen clothes and assess the damage without killing her from shock. He worked clinically, cutting away the torn buckskin dress, the ragged leggings, and the boots that were more holes than leather. Underneath, her body told a story of systematic cruelty, bruises in every stage of healing, ribs that had been broken and set poorly, and frostbite turning the toes of her right foot white and waxy. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, 3 layers of wool and fur, and filled glass bottles with hot water to place near her feet and core, careful not to burn the numb skin. The night passed in a blur of vigilance and small, desperate measures. Ethan boiled water mixed with whiskey and sugar, spooning the warm liquid between her blue lips whenever she seemed capable of swallowing. Most of it ran down her chin, but enough went down to matter. He sat in his chair near the roaring fire, watching the rise and fall of her chest, checking her pulse every 30 minutes as it slowly climbed from a terrifying 38 beats per minute to a more stable 50. He thought about the brand on her wrist, the letter D seared into her skin, and the rage that filled him was colder than the blizzard outside. He had killed men during the war and had seen horrors that would haunt him to his grave, but he had never tortured a soul, never treated a human being like livestock to be used and discarded. Whoever had done this had stripped her of humanity, or tried to, but the scars on her wrists where she had fought the ropes told him they hadn't succeeded. She was a fighter. Around midnight, her breathing deepened into something substantial, the shallow rattle disappearing, and the blue tinge left her lips to be replaced by the faintest flush of life. Ethan sat in the semi-darkness, his eyes burning with exhaustion, thinking that for the first time in 3 years, the cabin did not feel empty. It felt like a fortress protecting a single flickering candle of life, and he was the guard dog at the gate. He did not know her name, did not know her crimes or her history, but he knew that no one, Apache or white, deserved what had been done to her, and he made a silent vow to the empty room that whoever had held that branding iron would answer for it. Morning broke with a clarity that hurt the eyes. the sun reflecting off the snow with blinding intensity. Around 9 o'clock, the woman woke, and it was not a gentle return to consciousness, but an explosion of survival instinct. One moment she was still, and the next she lunged upright, the blankets shedding like water, her hand snatching the hunting knife Ethan had foolishly left on the bedside table. She was on her feet in a heartbeat, naked except for the bandages he had applied, backing into the corner with the knife held low and ready, her eyes wild with a rage that masked a terror so deep it looked like madness. Ethan stood slowly from his chair, keeping his hands visible and empty, making no move toward the revolver on his hip. "Easy," he said, pitching his voice to the low, steady rumble he used for spooked horses. She said nothing, her eyes darting around the room, cataloguing exits, weapons, and threats. She saw her own nakedness, saw the bandages, and for a split second, shame flickered across her face before the armor of rage slammed back into place. "Where am I?" she rasped, her voice ruined by screaming and cold, the words heavily accented but understandable. "My cabin," Ethan replied, not moving a muscle. "Found you in the snow. You were dying." She looked at the bandages, at the fire, at him, and then tightened her grip on the knife. "You help?" she asked, the concept seeming alien to her. "Yes." She searched his face for the lie, for the cruelty she had come to expect from white men, but found only a tired, unshaven man standing still in his own home. Why? The question hung between them, simple and devastating. Why save an Apache? Why save an enemy? Ethan looked at her, at the brand on her wrist and the defiance in her eyes, and realized he couldn't explain that he was simply tired of death. "Because you were dying," he said finally. It wasn't enough. He could see that, so he stepped slowly toward the door and opened it, letting the freezing air rush in. "You want to leave? Go. Won't stop you." He stepped aside, leaving the path clear. She stared at the open door, then at the frozen wilderness beyond, calculating the distance to safety against her own exhaustion and lack of clothing. She realized she would not last an hour. She looked back at him, the knife still raised, but the tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction. Ethan closed the door, cutting off the cold, and went to the pot of venison stew hanging over the fire. "There's soup," he said, ladling it into a bowl and setting it on the floor between them before retreating to his chair. She watched him, waited, and then crept forward to take the food, eating with the desperate intensity of the starving. When she finished, she set the bowl down but kept the knife. "My name is Ethan," he said into the silence. "Ethan Cole." She didn't respond for a long time, the fire popping and hissing as the wood shifted. Finally she looked at him, her dark eyes assessing, measuring, and perhaps deciding that for now this man was a lesser evil than the snow. "Ayana," she whispered, the name sounding like a prayer or a secret. "Ayana," Ethan repeated, nodding with respect. It was a start. That evening, as the wind picked up and howled around the eaves of the cabin, the inevitable question finally surfaced. They had eaten a stew of venison and wild onions, and the intimacy of the firelight seemed to demand truth. "What happened to you?" Ethan asked, sitting across from her with his hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee. "How did you end up in that snow?" Ayana stared into the flames for a long time, her jaw working as she chewed on the memories, tasting their bitterness. When she finally spoke, the story poured out of her, halting at first, then faster, a purge of poison. She told him of her birth in the Mimbres Mountains, of her husband Nathan, who had died fighting soldiers in 1876, and of her capture by Comancheros near the Rio Grande 2 years later. Comancheros, bandits who traded in human misery, respecting no border and no law. They had sold her for $30 to miners in Silver City, New Mexico territory. Her voice went flat and dead as she described the mining camp, a place of mud and cruelty where she was forced to haul water and wash clothes until her hands bled, and where beatings were the daily currency. She spoke of James Cutler, the miner who had bought her papers and claimed her as property, using a legal loophole regarding non-citizens to bypass the 13th Amendment. He was the one who had branded her wrist with the D for Doyle, the man he'd bought her from, marking her like cattle. He was the one who came to her tent at night. Ethan listened, his hands clenching into fists so tight his knuckles turned white, a cold, hard rage settling in his chest. He had seen the worst of humanity in the war, but this systematic degradation was a different kind of evil. Ayana continued, her eyes fixed on the past. In August, Cutler had announced his intention to sell her to a brothel in Santa Fe because she was too much trouble. That night, she waited until he was drunk and asleep, and she crushed his skull with a granite rock. She described the sound it made, a wet crunch that signaled her freedom, with zero remorse, only the grim satisfaction of survival. She had taken his horse and run, chased by a posse and a federal bounty hunter, riding north until the horse died, and she was left on foot in the blizzard where Ethan had found her. "Your law says I am murderer," she said, looking Ethan squarely in the eye, challenging him to revert to the sheriff he was supposed to be. "My law is wrong," Ethan replied, the words coming out with the force of a verdict. "There is a difference between murder and self-defense, a difference between justice and the law." He realized then that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. By all rights, he should arrest her. She was a fugitive, wanted for killing a white man in a territory that viewed her as less than human. But looking at the scars on her arms and the brand on her wrist, Ethan knew he would sooner burn his badge than put chains on her again. They sat in silence, two damaged people in a warm room surrounded by miles of killing cold, forging a pact that had no words but bound them together nonetheless. She went to sleep in the bed that night, and Ethan slept in the chair, weapon within reach, guarding her not as a prisoner but as a charge. The peace of the cabin was shattered the following morning by the arrival of Jacob Brennan. Ethan heard the horse crunching through the snow crust long before it came into view, the sound distinct in the thin air. He met his deputy outside, closing the door firmly to keep Ayana out of sight, though he knew she was watching from the window with the Winchester he had left her. Jake sat on his horse, his breath steaming, looking like a man carrying a burden he desperately wanted to set down. "Ethan," he said, skipping pleasantries. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a folded, stiff piece of paper. "We need to talk." Ethan unfolded the paper, and his heart hammered against his ribs. It was a wanted poster, cheaply printed but accurate enough. Apache woman, wanted for the murder of James Cutler, escape from custody, property destruction, reward $200. "Words out," Jake said quietly, his eyes full of apology. "Your nephew Billy saw you riding back with someone. Then this poster showed up at Silas's saloon with the mail coach this morning. Silas is stirring the pot, Ethan. He's telling folks you're harboring a savage killer." Ethan looked up, his face a mask of granite. "She's not a savage, Jake. She's a victim who fought back." Jake sighed, the long, weary exhalation of a man who sees a train wreck coming and can't switch the tracks. "I figured you'd say that, but Silas sees an Apache. He sees the people who killed his wife and daughter. He doesn't care about context. He's gathering a mob, Ethan, and there's talk of a federal bounty hunter named Morrison on his way." "Let them talk," Ethan said, crumpling the poster in his fist. "I'm not handing her over." Jake gathered his reins, his horse shifting in the cold. "I'm not asking you to. I'm just telling you the storm is coming. There's a town meeting tonight at 7. You should be there. If you don't show, Silas controls the narrative, and they'll be riding out here with torches by midnight." He paused, looking at the cabin door. "Whatever you're doing, Ethan, you better be ready to bleed for it, because that's where this ends." Jake turned his horse and rode back toward the tree line, leaving Ethan standing in the freezing morning with the crumpled evidence of Ayana's price in his hand. $200. That was what the law thought her life was worth. He turned back to the cabin, where Ayana stood waiting. She had heard everything. The walls were thin. "They come for me," she stated, reaching for the knife at her belt, her posture shifting instantly back to that of the hunted. "Not yet," Ethan said, tossing the poster into the fire where it curled and blackened, the face of the fugitive vanishing into ash. "But they're talking. I have to go to town tonight." "I go with you?" she asked. "No, you stay here, keep the door barred. If anyone comes who isn't me, you shoot first." She looked at him, confused by his obstinance. "Why?" she asked again, the question that had started it all. "They will take your badge. They will call you traitor." Ethan checked the load in his revolver, spinning the cylinder. "You're a person who deserves to live," he said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. "That's enough." The morning brought Ruth Keir, her wagon rattling up the frozen track before the sun had fully crested the mountains. Ethan met her at the door, rifle in hand, but lowered it when he recognized the grey mare. Ruth bustled in, bundled in so many furs she looked like a bear, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Inside!" she commanded, "before anyone sees." She unwrapped the bundle on the table to reveal 2 dresses of high-quality blue wool, undergarments and boots. "Civilized clothes," she said bluntly. "If we're going to save her, she needs to look like a person to them, not a target." But the clothes were just the prelude to the real news. Ruth slapped a folded newspaper onto the table, pointing to a marked article. "Morrison arrived last night. He's got papers, Ethan, real ones, and there's this." The article detailed a recent federal court ruling involving a man named Hank Doyle, the owner of the D brand. A judge had ruled that contracts executed before 1865 in Mexican territories remained legally binding, a loophole that effectively legalized slavery if the paperwork was old enough. "Doyle has papers claiming he bought you in 1864, Ruth explained, her face grim. "It's a lie, of course, but it's a lie stamped by a judge. If Morrison presents those papers, the law is on his side." The cabin went silent, the fire popping loudly. "There has to be a way," Ethan paced the floor. "There is," Ruth said, her voice dropping. "Under territorial law, a married woman cannot be held as property. Marriage grants her citizenship through her husband. It nullifies ownership claims." She looked from Ethan to Ayana. "You marry her, Ethan. Today. Before Morrison rides out here at noon. You make her Mrs. Cole, and suddenly she's not a fugitive slave. She's the sheriff's wife." They raced back to the cabin, the fresh marriage certificate tucked inside Ethan's coat like a loaded weapon. They arrived with only minutes to spare. Ethan built up the fire while Ayana made coffee, the domestic routine grounding them as the clock ticked toward noon. And at noon, Morrison came. He rode out of the tree line with 2 hired guns flanking him, men with hard eyes and hands hovering near their holsters. Ethan met them on the porch, rifle in the crook of his arm. Morrison didn't dismount. "Sheriff Cole," the bounty hunter called out, his voice thin and reedy. "I have a warrant for the Apache woman, and proof of ownership. Send her out." Ethan didn't move. "She's not going anywhere." Morrison sighed, reaching into his saddlebag. "We can do this the hard way or the easy way. Federal warrant supersedes your authority." "Not over a citizen," Ethan said calmly. "Not over my wife." The silence that followed was total. Morrison blinked, his composure cracking. "Your what?" Ethan pulled the certificate from his pocket, holding it up so the seal caught the light. "Married this morning. Reverend Thorne officiated. Legal and binding under territorial law. She's Mrs. Cole now, a citizen. And your ownership papers don't mean a damn thing against a marriage license." Morrison stared at the paper, his face purpling. He knew the law as well as Ethan did. The marriage was a masterstroke of obstruction. "This is fraud," Morrison spat. "It's a sham." "It's legal," Ethan countered. "And if you try to take her, you're kidnapping the wife of a law officer. My deputy is in the trees with a sharp's rifle. You might get me, but you won't leave this valley alive." It was a bluff. Jake was miles away in town, but Morrison couldn't know that. The bounty hunter looked at the tree line, then at Ethan's unyielding stance, and finally at the cabin window where Ayana stood, visible now, holding Ethan's spare revolver. He calculated the odds and found them wanting. "This isn't over," Morrison growled, wheeling his horse around. "I'll go to the territorial capital. I'll get a judge to annul this farce. I'll be back with a platoon if I have to." "We'll be here," Ethan said, though he knew it was a lie. As soon as Morrison and his men disappeared into the trees, the tension wire snapped. Ethan slumped against the doorframe, letting out a breath he felt he'd been holding for hours. Ayana came out, the gun lowered, and looked at him with wide eyes. "He left?" "For now," Ethan said. "He'll go to Cheyenne. He'll get the annulment. We bought 3 days, maybe 4. He turned to her, the reality of their situation settling in. The marriage had worked as a stall tactic, but it wasn't a victory. It was a delay. "We can't stay here," Ethan said. "If he comes back with a judge's order, or if Silas decides to take matters into his own hands tonight, we're dead." Ayana nodded, her mind already moving to the logistics of flight. "Where do we go?" "Fort Laramie," Ethan decided. "The army is there, federal troops. And your cousin, Yellowhawk, you said he was a scout. If we can find him, if he can testify that you were free in '64, we can prove Doyle's papers are forgeries. It's our only chance." They spent the afternoon preparing for exile, It was a bitter task, packing up the life Ethan had built, knowing they might never return. They took food, ammunition, blankets, and weapons. Ethan saddled Sable in the gelding, checking the cinches 3 times. As the sun began to dip, casting long purple shadows across the snow, Billy rode up. The boy looked scared, but determined, a rucksack slung over his shoulder. "I'm going with you," he announced before his uncle could speak. "No, Billy," Ethan started, but the boy cut him off. "She's family now. You said family stands together. I'm not staying here with Silas and his hate." Ethan looked at his nephew, seeing the man he was becoming, and nodded. "All right, but you follow orders." They rode out at dusk, 3 fugitives heading northeast into the teeth of the winter, leaving the cabin dark and empty behind them. The first night passed in a blur of cold and miles. They made camp in a stand of cottonwoods huddled around a small, smokeless fire. "You really killed a man?" Billy asked Ayana as they ate cold rabbit. "Yes," she said, no shame in her voice. "He was going to sell me. I chose to live." Billy nodded, accepting this hard truth. "Does that make you evil?" "No," the boy said, echoing the lessons Ethan had tried to teach him. "That makes you strong." That night, Ethan took the first watch. He sat in the darkness, listening to the breathing of his new wife and his nephew, watching the stars wheel overhead, and realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living, and he had something to lose. The second day brought the storm. It began innocently enough, a few lazy flakes drifting down from a slate-gray sky, but by noon it had mutated into a white monster. The wind screamed down from the peaks, driving snow horizontally, erasing the world until they couldn't see the horses' ears. They pushed on, blind and freezing, until the animals began to flounder in drifts chest deep. "We need shelter," Ethan yelled over the gale, his voice snatched away by the wind. He remembered an old line shack from his rustler tracking days, a tumble-down structure of rotting logs 1/2 mile north. If he could find it. If it still stood. They dismounted and led the horses, Ethan breaking trail with his body, sensing the landscape more than seeing it. They found the shack by colliding with it. It was a ruin, half the roof caved in, but it was salvation. They crowded inside, horses and humans packed together for warmth, and waited. The storm raged for 36 hours, a white siege that trapped them in a single room. In that enforced intimacy, barriers broke down. Ayana told stories of her people, of the mountains before the white men came, of the medicine plants and the spirit walks. Ethan spoke of the war, of the ghosts he carried, and on the second night, while Billy slept exhausted in the corner, Ayana moved to Ethan in the dark. "You have purpose now," she whispered, her hand finding his. "We fight for this." She kissed him then, not the seal on a legal contract, but a claim. A desperate, hungry affirmation of life in the face of the freezing void. They held each other as the wind howled, 2 broken pieces fusing together in the heat of survival. The storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, shattering the grey oppression of the sky to reveal a world transformed into blinding, painful brilliance. They emerged from the line shack like creatures surfacing from hibernation, squinting against a sun that reflected off millions of facets of ice, turning the landscape into a vast field of diamonds that offered no heat. The silence was absolute, the howling wind replaced by a stillness so profound that the crunch of their boots on the snow crust sounded like thunder. They dug the horses out, the animals shivering and eager to move, and resumed their trek northeast, pushing their exhausted bodies because stopping meant death. But the storm had cost them time, and time was the one resource they could not scavenge. On the second night after leaving the shack, seeking respite from the cutting wind, Ethan made a tactical error born of fatigue. He led them into a narrow slot canyon, a jagged scar in the earth with high rock walls that offered shelter but stole their sightlines. It felt safe in the twilight, a natural fortress against the elements, but as the moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across the canyon floor, Ethan woke with the instinctive jolt of a man who realizes the trap has already snapped shut. He heard the horses first, not their own, but the heavy, deliberate tread of mounts being positioned to block the exit. He reached for his rifle, shaking Ayana and Billy awake with a sharp hiss and they scrambled away from the dying fire, taking cover behind the tumbled boulders just as 5 silhouettes appeared on the canyon rim, blotting out the stars. The leader of the riders sat tall in his saddle, his shape backlit by the moon, emanating an aura of arrogant possession. Even before he spoke, the air in the canyon grew heavy with the threat of him. "Cole!" The voice echoed off the stone walls, distorted and booming. "I know you're down there. I can see the fire. Give me the woman and you can ride away. This doesn't have to end in blood." It was Hank Doyle. The man whose initial was burned into Ayana's wrist had come personally, unwilling to trust a bounty hunter to reclaim his property. Ethan raised his Winchester, resting the barrel on the cold granite of the boulder, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "She's not yours," he shouted back, his voice steady despite the odds. "Never was." Doyle laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. "I got papers that say different. Papers older than your fancy marriage certificate. Papers that say I bought her fair and square in '64. He nudged his horse forward, descending the scree slope with practiced ease, his men spreading out to flank the camp. "The army says those papers are forgeries," Ethan called out, trying to buy time, trying to find a target in the shifting shadows. "Army ain't here right now," Doyle retorted, leveling a heavy revolver. "Just you, me, and the law of the dollar, and the law says she's mine." Ayana stood up then, breaking cover, her silhouette defiant against the rock. "The law says I'm free," she screamed, her voice raw with years of suppressed rage. "I am citizen, I am wife, I am human," Doyle sneered, the expression audible in his tone. "You're livestock that learned to talk, nothing more." The first shot cracked the night open, a flash of muzzle bloom from the rim that sent a bullet whining off the rock inches from Billy's head. Then, the canyon erupted. Ethan fired, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder, and saw one of Doyle's men spin out of the saddle, clutching his thigh. Billy joined in, his rifle cracking with a rhythmic precision that belied his youth, dropping a rider who had tried to flank them on the left. But they were pinned down, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Bullets chipped away at their cover, sending stone fragments stinging into their faces. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of reports and ricochets amplified by the canyon walls. Ethan worked the lever of his rifle, firing, reloading, firing, but he could feel the noose tightening. Doyle was advancing through the center, fearless in his greed, using the suppression fire from his men to close the distance. He wanted Ayana alive, but he didn't care about the others. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Ethan's coat, burning the skin. Another kicked up dirt into Ayana's eyes. They were trapped. Doyle was 40 yards away, then 30, his face twisted into a mask of victorious malice. He leveled his gun at Ayana, shouting over the din, "If I can't have you, nobody will!" His finger tightened on the trigger, the executioner ready to claim his due. Ethan tried to swing his rifle around, but he was pinned by fire from the rim, helpless to stop the inevitable. He screamed her name, a useless sound lost in the roar of gunfire. The shot that ended it did not come from Ethan, nor from Billy. It came from the darkness behind Doyle, a single, thunderous report from a heavy-caliber buffalo gun. Doyle jerked forward in his saddle as if kicked by a mule, his eyes going wide with shock and sudden, confusing pain. A red bloom expanded across the back of his expensive duster coat, spreading like spilled wine on a tablecloth. His revolver tumbled from nerveless fingers, and he slumped, sliding slowly sideways until he hit the dirt with the heavy final thud of dead weight. The canyon went instantly silent, the remaining hired guns freezing, their paycheck lying dead in the dust. From the shadows of the canyon entrance, a lone rider emerged, smoke drifting lazily from the barrel of a Sharp's rifle. The moonlight caught the rider's face, hard, weathered, carved from granite and regret. It was Silas Grayson, the saloon owner, the man who had whipped the town into a frenzy against them, sat there looking at the body of the man he had just killed. Doyle's men, realizing the tide had turned and their leader was gone, didn't wait for an invitation. They wheeled their horses and scrambled up the scree, vanishing into the night like the paid cowards they were. Silas didn't pursue them. He rode forward slowly, his horse picking its way through the rocks, until he stopped 10 feet from where Ethan and Ayana stood, their weapons still raised in disbelief. Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, his mind struggling to reconcile the man who had preached hate in the town hall with the man holding the smoking gun. "Silas," he breathed. Silas looked down at Doyle's corpse, his expression one of cold satisfaction mingled with weary resignation. "Followed you from town," he grunted. Took me 2 days to catch up through the storm. Heard Doyle was coming himself. Figured the odds weren't fair. Why? Ethan asked, stepping out from the rocks, placing himself between Silas and Ayana. You hate her. You hate us. Silas looked at Ayana then, his eyes tracking the scars on her face, the defiant set of her jaw. I did, he admitted, the words dragging out of him like stones. My wife, my daughter, they died screaming. For 3 years, that scream was all I heard. I blamed every Indian I saw. Didn't matter who, didn't matter why. He shifted in his saddle, looking at his hands. But you stubborn son of a bitch. You stood up in that hall and called her human. You married her. You threw away your badge, your home, your standing. All for her. He looked back at Ethan. Made me think. My Martha, she was a kind woman. She wouldn't have wanted me turning into this. She'd have been ashamed to see me standing with men like Doyle, men who treat people like cattle. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked toward Ayana. She tensed, her hand dropping to her knife, ready to fight this new threat. But Silas stopped out of striking range. He looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the layers of his own prejudice to see the person beneath. I'm sorry, he said. The apology was rough, unpolished, a raw thing bleeding in the cold air. For the things I said, for the poster, you didn't kill my family. And even if your people did, you ain't them. You're just a woman trying to stay free. Ayana stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for deceit but finding only a tired, broken man trying to mend something he had shattered. She nodded slowly, a gesture of immense grace. Your hate was heavy, she said softly. I could feel it. But this is honest. Silas huffed a breath that might have been a laugh. Don't expect me to be friendly in town. I got a reputation to maintain. He gestured toward the northeast. Fort Laramie is another day's ride. I'll ride guard with you until you're in sight of the walls. After that, you're on your own. He turned and walked back to his horse, a solitary figure carrying the weight of his ghosts. Silas, Ethan called out. The big man paused, hand on the saddle horn. Thank you. Silas didn't look back, just nodded once and swung up onto his mount. Let's get moving, he said gruffly. Doyle's dead, but the cold ain't. Spring arrived slowly, fighting the winter for every inch of ground, but eventually the snow receded, the creek thawed into a roaring torrent, and green shoots pushed up through the mud. With the thaw came the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Ethan and Ayana expanded the cabin, adding a second bedroom and a proper porch, their days filled with the rhythm of hammers and saws. Billy came out every weekend to help, the young man becoming the bridge between their isolation and the town. Acceptance was not a flood, but a trickle. It began when Doc Harrison, overwhelmed with a dysentery outbreak, quietly asked for Ayana's help. She brought willow bark and knowledge of hydration passed down through generations of desert living. When a rancher's son broke his leg and the fever set in, it was Ayana's poultice that drew out the infection. Some people still crossed the street to avoid her, spitting on the ground where she walked, but others, desperate mothers, hurting laborers, began to nod in greeting. On a warm day in late May, 6 months after Ethan had found her dying in the snow, Ayana found him by the creek and delivered news that shifted the axis of their world again. I'm with child, she said simply, her hand resting on her stomach. Ethan dropped the water bucket he was holding. A child. A life created from the ashes of their trauma, a defiance of death itself. You're sure? I know the signs. By winter we will be 3. Ethan pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, terrified and elated. They were bringing a child into a world that hated him for his blood. But as Ethan held his wife, he vowed that this child would know only strength. We'll protect them, he whispered. We'll make sure they grow up free. Winter returned, as it always did, claiming the high country with snow and silence. But this time the cabin was not a tomb. It was warm, filled with dried herbs and the smell of baking bread and the anticipation of life. Thomas Nathan Cole was born in December of 1879, during the first true blizzard of the season. He came into the world screaming, a warrior's cry that echoed off the log walls. Ayana labored for 18 hours with Ruth and Doc Harrison attending, while Ethan paced the main room, reliving the ghosts of his past loss. But when the cry came, the ghosts vanished. Ethan held his son, small, red-faced, with a grip that felt like iron, and felt the last stone of grief lift from his chest. This was not a replacement for the family he had lost. This was a new chapter, written in bold ink. The town's reaction was a mirror of its soul. Some whispered about half-breeds and mongrels, but others, like Jake and even the stoic blacksmith, sent small gifts: a knitted blanket, a wooden rattle. Humanity, it seemed, was contagious. By 1884, 5 years later, Thomas was a whirlwind of energy, running through the pine forest with a fluency in both English and Apache that startled visitors. The cabin had grown into a homestead with a barn, livestock, and a garden that fed them through the long winters. Ayana was pregnant again, carrying their daughter Margaret Neon Cole, named for the past and the beautiful present. The scars on Ayana's back had faded to silver lines, a map of a country she no longer inhabited. She was no longer the hunted. She was the matriarch, the healer, the anchor. One evening, a testament to the slow erosion of hate appeared on their porch. Thomas had gotten lost in the woods during a sudden squall, sparking a frantic search. When he was found, sheltering under a windfall, it was Silas Grayson who had spotted him. Silas had carried the boy back to town on his saddle, wrapping him in his own coat. He had handed Thomas to Ethan without a word, his eyes avoiding Ayana's gratitude, and ridden away. The next morning, a hand-carved wooden horse, intricate and beautiful, sat on the porch railing. There was no note, but Ethan recognized the whittling style Silas was known for. It was an olive branch carved from pine, a silent admission that the war was over. That evening, as the sun set, painting the mountains in hues of violet and gold, Ethan sat on the porch watching Thomas practice roping a fence post. The boy was fierce and joyful, a living testament to their victory. Ayana sat beside Ethan, heavy with their daughter, her hand in his. "What are you thinking?" she asked, sensing his mood. "I'm thinking about the snow," Ethan admitted, "about how cold it was that day, and how warm it is now." Thomas succeeded in lassoing the post and let out a whoop of triumph. "Tell me a story, Papa," he demanded, running up the steps. "Tell me about the old days." "Which old days?" "When you were a warrior and Mama was a scout, before I was born." Ethan looked at Ayana and she smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, free of shadows. "Once," Ethan began, pulling his son into his lap, "in the coldest winter anyone could remember, a sheriff rode out into the snow and found a fire that wouldn't go out." The story of Ethan and Ayana did not end with a gunshot or a dramatic death, but with the quiet, enduring victory of survival. The cabin stood in the pine forest for generations, expanding and changing as their children and grandchildren added rooms and stories to its walls. Thomas grew up to be a man who walked between worlds with his head high, a rancher who knew the law and the land. Margaret became a teacher who ensured that the history of her people was not erased by the whitewashed books of the territory. Locals in Bitter Ridge eventually forgot the scandal of the marriage and remembered only the family that held the community together during the harsh winters and the lean years. The brand on Ayana's wrist never went away, but it ceased to be a mark of ownership and became a symbol of what she had overcome. On cold December nights, when the wind howled down from the peaks like something alive and hungry, the descendants of the original settlers would tell the story of the sheriff and the Apache woman. They told it not as a tragedy, but as a legend of resilience. They spoke of a love that was harder than diamond and warmer than fire. And in the end, that was the legacy Ethan and Ayana left behind. Not wealth, not fame, but the revolutionary truth that hatred is a season, and like winter, it eventually yields to the spring. The story ended where it began, in the high country, in the snow. But this time, the silence was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of laughter, of children playing, and of two people who had looked into the abyss of the world's cruelty and chosen, against all odds, to build a home.